how we can use technology, how we can use processes, how we can use the fact that people are changing their behaviors to redesign finance in a different way. And for me, FinTech will have a social impact, which you see in, for example, in Africa, in Asia, but in general, FinTech should and must have a social impact. In the case of FinTech, I think the timing is really now. Finance is one of the rare sectors that haven't been that impacted by technology. And this is happening now. This is happening now on the consumer side. This is happening now for investment banks. This is happening now for asset managers, for insurance. So all of that is happening now and for the next 10, 20 years. So I would have a slightly different view from a lot of my FinTech friends on Bitcoin and blockchain. To give you a summary of Bitcoin, Bitcoin as a digital currency was very big a few years ago. And behind Bitcoin was the concept of blockchain. And the blockchain, or the concept of ledger, was the idea that you could send currency, that you could send money from one place to the other without the concept of a trusted third party. So with the idea that if I wanted to send money from London to Singapore, for example, instead of having to go through, let's say, 5 correspondent banks, I could send the money directly from London to Singapore through some kind of network, which I don't really have to know about, and pretty much for the same price as email and at the same speed as email. That was the idea of Bitcoin and blockchain. Today, in terms of blockchain, a lot of people are talking about blockchain as a revolution for any kind of financial information and financial data, and especially for banks. So we talk about blockchain for settlement, for example. We talk about blockchain for storing information, storing property rights, exchanging property rights, etc., etc. I'm slightly skeptical about blockchain compared to, I would say, a lot of people. And the reason for me is that blockchain is an amazing vision. The vision that you can send information without a trusted third party is a very, very powerful one. And that's definitely one of the benefits of blockchain. Where I don't fully agree on is the fact that blockchain will have any kind of impact soon. Exactly in the same way as my startup was very early, exactly in the same way as 15 years ago, we were talking about mobile payment, which hasn't really happened in the Western world. Blockchain for me is something that will happen, but will take much, much more time than expected. And the reason is that blockchain for me today is still at the level of research and development. I don't think that we have a protocol which is robust enough. I don't think that we have an infrastructure which is robust enough so that we can use it for any kind of financial information. So the first applications for blockchain could be actually quite different from things like finance, but could be actually much more mundane, for example. It could be linked to the Internet of Things, it could be linked to other things, which needs less reliability than sending money from one place to the other. Definitely, there are a lot. If you look at the FinTech space in general, the FinTech space is huge. If you look at London, a few years ago in London you had, let's say, 100 FinTech startups. Today you would have, let's say, 1,000 FinTech startups, much, much more than that. And if you look at where they are pretty much everywhere. You take any field in finance, be it banking, be it insurance, asset management, private banking, investment bank, you do have FinTech startups pretty much everywhere. Which ones are interesting today? Because obviously there are so many. If you look in terms of funding, the startups that have the most funding so far are startups which are in payment and lending. Lending would be, for example, peer-to-peer lending, like Lending Club or SoFi in the US, like Funding Circle in the UK, for example. Those, I think, have revolutionized the way that we're looking at the lending world and will have an impact and will continue to have an impact. On the payment side, obviously we had the IPO of Square last week, we have Stripe, so we have quite a few companies on the payment side, which actually are quite linked to the banking system and trying to optimize the way that we do payments. So that's only 2 examples, but if you think of all the other examples, there are actually quite a lot. Some of them are very attractive, for example, SME. And SME lending, SME FX transfer is a field which is very, very interesting because you do have obviously quite a lot of SMEs that do have quite a lot of need. And the more you can digitalize all of that, the easier it is for them. So you do have quite a lot of opportunities, I think, on the SME side. You do have also a lot on what I would call credit scoring. Credit scoring is something I like quite a lot because if you think of it from a conceptual standpoint, what is Google? Google is basically a way for someone to know all the things that you're doing online. Facebook is the same, but they know everything about what you do within your network. What is the equivalent in finance? It's credit scoring. It's the ability to know what you do from a financial standpoint and monetize it. So credit scoring for me is one of the key components where a lot of things will be built around that, and the best example would be Credit Karma, for example, in the US. Yeah, so London is definitely the capital of the world for FinTech, which you can see just in terms of numbers of startups. I think you have the most FinTech startups in London. In terms of numbers of accelerators, for example, we have the most accelerators in London. I think there are a few reasons. The first one is the ecosystem in general, because for FinTech, you need to have a strong ecosystem from a financial standpoint, and obviously between London and New York, you do have the 2 financial capitals of the world, so which is one reason. The second reason is talent. You have a lot of talent in London, not only from people who were already from the financial background, but also because of the European crisis, you have had a lot of people coming from Europe into London. At the same time, you have 3 or 4 of the best universities in the world, which are just around London. So you do have a lot of talents coming from those universities. And the last reason is basically the regulator. We do have a regulator which is very, very pragmatic in London. Perhaps one of the best regulators for FinTech, which is really driving innovation and making sure that innovation isn't too cumbersome from a regulatory standpoint. That's a difficult question. That's a difficult question in the sense that there'd be a yes and no. As an entrepreneur, so if you were, let's say, a 25-year-old entrepreneur, you don't necessarily need to have a background in finance, I think, to do something in FinTech. But very, very quickly within your team, you'd need to have people who do have an experience of finance or banking or insurance, for example, for a lot of reasons. But the main reason is that you don't really want to reinvent the wheel. There's no point trying to do a credit scoring system and recreate it from scratch when people have been doing it for years. So as an entrepreneur, I don't think that you need to have a background in finance, but in your core team, very, very quickly, you need people who have this kind of experience. Definitely. We're really at the beginning. And I'll give you an example. Money Supermarket in the UK, I think it was created perhaps 15 years ago, 10 years ago. One of the most interesting startups in Asia this year is Compare Asia Group, which is pretty much a money supermarket for Asia. And you think that in 15 years, you would have had a lot of them in Asia. Actually, you don't have anything in Asia. And actually, even in some countries in Europe, you don't have the equivalent of a supermarket, of an online supermarket for financial services. So there's still a lot that can be built around that. If you think of email, for example, email has been around for a long, long time, and you still have people developing email services as of today, because there's still a lot to be done around that. So I wouldn't underestimate the fact that it's a huge market. Finance is a huge market in general, and there's a lot to be done around that, and we're really just at the beginning of this. Actually, it's more than that. I think one of the biggest opportunities in FinTech is in the developing world. And in exactly the same way as we saw the development of mobile phones in the developing world, I think that FinTech will follow the same kind of pattern. In the developing world, if you remember 10 or 15 years ago, there was absolutely no telecom infrastructure. But what happened after a few years, instead of going from no infrastructure to fixed line phones to mobile phones, we leapfrogged directly from no infrastructure to mobile phones, just because there wasn't any need to make the transition to fixed line phones. And that's pretty much what you're seeing in finance at the moment, which is you do still have quite a lot of countries in Asia or in Africa where there are a lot of underbanked people or even companies. And what we're seeing is that instead of going through all the different paths that we've seen in Western Europe or in the US of having a whole banking system, an insurance system, an asset management system, etc., you could jump directly to paying on your mobile phone, which is exactly what we've seen, for example, in Kenya. So I think the example of Safaricom in Kenya is the best example of what's happening in FinTech, which is that mobile payments never took off in Europe or in the US just because you already had alternatives like cash or credit or debit cards, which were very good, which were perhaps not optimal, but which were already very good. You didn't have any of that in Africa, but people had a lot of mobile phones. So we leapfrogged directly into mobile payment. So that's quite interesting to see that the most penetration rate for mobile payment is in Africa and not at all in our countries. And that's exactly the opportunity that I think you're going to see in FinTech in, for example, Africa or South America or Asia, is all those innovations which are linked to the fact that in those countries, the penetration rate for mobile phone is huge. It's huge. In some cases, it's pretty much the same as we have here. But on the other hand, in terms of financial services, it's not developed at all. That's hard to say. That's hard to say. I give you a few examples of from very early stage to very late stage. From very early stage, two startups were, obviously I will be very biased. One of them, which is FinTech Hong Kong. FinTech Hong Kong is the largest ecosystem for FinTech in Hong Kong. And they launched the Supercharger. And the Supercharger will be one of the, or perhaps the most unique accelerators for FinTech in Asia. And what they're doing is that in their accelerator, they are taking early stage Asian startups and mixing them with late stage European or American startups that want to move to Asia. And by mixing all of that, they're trying to find the next Google of finance, but for Asia. The second one, where we'll also be very biased because I have invested in them, is a Loot Bank. And Loot is basically a bank for students in the UK, because there are a lot of students, including international students coming to the UK, who always find it challenging to open a bank account. What is very interesting for them is not only the vertical specialization on students. What is interesting is their business model, is the way they're trying to make money. So unlike a traditional bank where they would make money from transaction fees or they would make money from income, here they would try to make money by using data monetization, data that they have on their students. So that is interesting for me. That would be the way that Google would be monetizing the data if Google wanted to create a bank. So that's on the early stage, I would say. On the, let's say, mid-stage kind of startups, there's a sector I really like, which is SMEs, with two companies. One of them, which is a FinExCap, SME financing in France, SME in the sense of invoice financing. It's a model I really like, and the reason why I really like is that it's very streamlined, it's very optimized. It's all about doing something that has been done forever, but in a much more efficient and digitalized way. Pretty much the same for Cantox, which does currency transfers, but for SMEs. Again, this SME space is quite interesting because it's not the same as the retail space in terms of marketing, etc., etc. But on the other hand, the transactions can be quite big. So the marketing is quite interesting. So that would be on the mid-stage side. In general, I really like things which are linked to SME. And for late stage companies, I really like 3 of them start with a K, and one of them not. So I couldn't find 4 that started with a K. The first one I think would be Klarna. Klarna is a very interesting company that started on something which is very mundane, which is basically how to pay on a website. The equivalent of PayPal, you create a website, how can I get paid? And I'll spare you the story, you really need to go to their website. But what is amazing from Klarna is that they started as pretty much an online checkout kind of system. And because they were doing that, they had to extend short-term credit, and because they had to extend short-term credit, they needed to have deposits, and so they bought the equivalent of a bank. And because they started to have all of that, they're starting pretty much to look like a bank, but they started from something which was very, very mundane. And I think that's a lot of the things that we will see, which are applications that will start from something that doesn't seem that important within the financial system, and as startups are being built and are getting bigger and bigger, suddenly you feel that you need to have lending, and you need to have borrowing, and you need to have currency transfers, etc., and then suddenly it really looks like some kind of large financial institution. So Klarna is a good example. The other one is Cabbage. Cabbage is one of the first companies that use data-led lending. So lending with real-time information, in that case information linked to your account on eBay, Amazon, PayPal, etc. It's the future. It's the future in the sense that I think all banks will at one point also use data-led lending instead of manual lending. And Cabbage was one of the pioneers in that space. The third one is Credit Karma, so also with a K. And Credit Karma is all about credit scoring. And credit scoring is definitely one of the fields I really like. But one of the main challenges of credit scoring is, where do you start? This idea, which is this big vision of having all the financial information and doing something around that, it's a great idea. It will happen, but when? And Credit Karma actually starts with exactly the same vision, but they start with something which can be very easily monetizable. So that's the interesting part of Credit Karma. And the last example for me would be SoFi, which is peer-to-peer lending in the US. And there are a lot of peer-to-peer lending companies in the US. What I like about SoFi is the profile of the founders. SoFi is a company which is around peer-to-peer lending with founders that come from traditional finance. And so what the benefit of this kind of setup is that the founders do not have to reinvent the world. So for example, SoFi was one of the first, or the first peer-to-peer lender to use securitization, to have rated securitization rated by S&P, for example. So all the things that you do in traditional finance, they know about it, and they just replicate it using new processes, new innovation, new technology. And I think that's the kind of profile which is very interesting in FinTech. It's very, very hard to say, because you do have quite a lot of different profiles of founders, and I don't think there's a common dream of founders of FinTech. I think if you had to ask me, there would be about how we can use technology, how we can use processes, how we can use the fact that people are changing their behaviors to redesign finance in a different way. For example, the way that you pay with Uber is obviously very, very different from anything we would have imagined 10 years ago. You enter into a taxi, you get out of the taxi, you've paid, end of the story. This is something that exists today. This is something that people never imagined 10 years ago. And I think that's just a very, very small example, but finance in general, whether on the retail side, whether on the investment banking side, on the asset management side, will be very, very different, just because new behaviors will be created. That's all about behaviors. And so when I was talking about timing, it's all about that. It's not about just the technology and creating new products which are just do things that someone would have dreamed somewhere. It's that the behaviors of people have changed. The way that people use their mobile phones has changed. The way that people are much more trustful about things online, for example, has changed. The way that people think of the digital world of things which do not have to be materialized, for example, has totally changed. So I think it's all about behaviors which will bring new products in the future. That's definitely a trend that we see. If you look at banks in general, but also if you look at insurance companies or asset managers, a lot of them have put resources into innovation, into technology, through venture funds, through accelerators, through different types of initiatives. So I think pretty much all banks and insurance companies have realized that technology is a big part of their business. So it's not only Goldman; it's a lot of people. I don't think it will change much, in the sense that in terms of the position in itself, all the positions that you would have today, in terms of working in an investment bank, working on the trading floor, etc., all those positions, will be pretty much the same. Obviously, what they do on a day-to-day basis will be different in terms of the tools that could be different. In the sense that today you'd be using Bloomberg, in the future you might be using other types of tools or some kind of artificial intelligence, kind of tool. That I think will change, but it's just a tool. Now, in terms of your career, in a bank, it might be different after that. It might be different in the sense that it might be less linear than today. Today, you could expect to start as a trader and 10 years, 15 years, 20 years later to still be a trader. In the future, it might be different just because technology will impact that so much. And I think, perhaps banks will also want people to have different, a less linear career in banking. Yeah, so the World Economic Forum basically is around a theme I really like, which is the social impact. That as an entrepreneur or as anyone, basically, you want to have a social impact. And for me, FinTech will have a social impact, which you see in, for example, in Africa, in Asia, but in general, FinTech should and must have a social impact, even if you work in Europe, in London, or in the US. And the World Economic Forum is about that. It's about develop. And so I was helping for the report on SME financing, or SME in general, and to see how innovation could help SMEs in general. And what we see for SMEs is that there are a lot of challenges for SMEs, but one of the main challenges would be on the financing side, on the funding side. Could be a lot. Could be the fact that it is expensive in general for banks to serve SMEs, and so the report of the World Economic Forum was to see how we could overcome those challenges through FinTech. That was one part of it, but much more broadly about the whole ecosystem, about how governments or the regulators or whoever around that could help the SME sector. So for me, the World Economic Forum is interesting because that's the other side of entrepreneurship, which is entrepreneurship obviously is something which is important, in terms of commercial success, but entrepreneurs today have such an impact in general, from a commercial standpoint, from a financial standpoint, that they really have to care about their impact on society. And for example, the World Economic Forum is a very, very good place for that.